Listen-only mode.
Good afternoon, folks, and welcome to today's EPIP webinar, Intent to Discriminate, Not Required, Understanding a Structural Race Lens. This is actually our 13th webinar of 2014. Many of you who have joined in the past probably know my voice by now. I'm Michael Barham, your host for this afternoon, and I'm joined by four fantastic panelists, Angela Brown and Naomi Torres of the Hyams Foundation, and Dennis Chin and Julia Beatty of the Center for Social Inclusion. Very excited for the conversation today. We're going to get started shortly. But before we do, we'd like to tell you all a little bit more about EPIP for those of you who are not familiar with who we are and what we do. We're a national network of foundation professionals and social entrepreneurs who strive for excellence in the practice of philanthropy. We are also an inclusive group of highly skilled and effective change makers committed to working together to build a just, equitable, and sustainable society. You're all probably thinking, well, that's well and good, but what does that mean? What do you do? Well, we provide a platform for our community to connect with others, learn and practice leadership skills, and voice emerging transformative thoughts in the social sector. We do this through a variety of activities, local workshops and networking events. Hopefully many of you are familiar with our 12 local chapters throughout the country, and also through a variety of national events and conferences, and our online community, Member Connect, and through webinars like the one you are all joining today. For those of you who are not yet EPIP members, it's a great time to join. For more information, you can visit epip.org/membership or contact me, Michael, at epip.org. I'm always happy to chat EPIP. We have some fantastic events coming up. Our People of Color Network gathering at the Facing Race Conference is taking place in November, from November 13th to 15th in Dallas, Texas. For those of you unfamiliar with the PCN, it's a fantastic national gathering. The content is really threefold: making personal connections to social justice work, understanding structural racism, bringing this work back home. This year's PCN is open to all people of color and white allies. We're very excited about it. It's taking place on the 13th and then leading right into the Facing Race Conference, which is a 3-day affair. So for more information, feel free to visit the website. We also have a webinar coming up in 2 weeks, Matching Money and Mission. We're focusing on mission-related investing, joined by a board member of EPIP and Cerna Foundation staff member, Beth Hertz, and Tisha Cash of Jalea Ventures. So we're very excited about that webinar. Mark that date down 2 weeks from today. And as always, for national events, local events near you, check out epip.org/events. Okay, pretty close to getting started, folks. A couple of items of housekeeping. We've kept all attendees on mute during the presentation. And if you're calling in on the phone, please be sure to mute your computer. We want to make sure to avoid any of that background noise. If you have any technical difficulties, I'll be keeping an eye on the question box throughout. So please just shoot us a quick message there. And we will reserve time at the end for Q&A. So if you have questions for the presenters while they're presenting, feel free to enter them. We'll keep an eye on those and save them for the Q&A 10 or 15 minutes at the end. We are recording this webinar, so if you, for any reason, have to jump off early or you want to check it out down the road, please take a look at the website. It should be up by early next week, and help us improve what we're doing. We're always looking for feedback from members and attendees. Please complete the post-webinar survey and let us learn as we work. Okay, we're going to get started very soon. Just want to make sure you guys know a little bit about our presenters. Angela Brown is the Director of Programs at the Hyams Foundation. She oversees the foundation's work in affordable housing, civic engagement, and teen development areas, including grant making to public policy advocacy and community organizing groups. We're also joined by Naomi Torres of the Hyams Foundation. She's the Teen Development Program Officer there. She joined in 2012 with a background in access to educational opportunities for Boston teens and positive youth development. Prior to coming to Hyams, she was a program officer for education at the Boston Foundation, where she worked on TBF's college completion portfolio. We're also joined by the coordinator for leadership initiatives, Julia Beatty of Center for Social Inclusion. She develops trainings for CSI and oversees CSI's New Leaders Initiative. She brings a strong background in community organizing, public policy advocacy, organizational development, and social justice philanthropy to her work with leaders, organizations, and communities. And last, certainly not least, is Dennis Chin, the communications coordinator for Center for Social Inclusion. He crafts CSI's overall communication strategy with a focus on media relations and digital strategy. He also manages and curates CSI's media content, which includes reports, blogs, website, copy, and editorials. So without further ado, I am going to actually toss it to our speakers at Center for Social Inclusion, Dennis and Julia. Hang on, guys, just 1 second. And folks, bear with us. We're going to share their screen.
All right. Let me just full screen this. Awesome. Okay.
Hi, guys.
Oh, hey. Thank you for that really awesome introduction, Michael.
Thank you.
And good afternoon, everyone. I wish I could see all of your faces, but it is a webinar, alas. Just wanted to thank you for joining us today, and thank you to Michael and EPIP for coordinating this. I'm Dennis, and I'm with the Center for Social Inclusion, CSI for short, and I'm here with my amazing colleague, Julia Beatty, and we're really grateful to be here to share our work. And usually our structural racism workshop is a minimum 2-hour workshop. So we only have a few minutes today, so I'm just going to jump right in. Okay, so a little bit about who we are. So the Center for Social Inclusion, what we do is we work to identify and support policy strategies to transform structural inequity and exclusion into structural fairness and inclusion. And that's a lot. So what does that mean? Essentially, it means we work to make racial equity and fairness a reality in the United States. And so what do I mean by racial equity? I think it's important to talk about that term as well. And here's how we define racial equity. So we think of it as the floor beneath which no one falls, where we no longer see racial disparities, like, for example, the racial achievement gap in schools, or like the widening racial wealth gap. If our society were truly inclusive and fair, we would all share in the burdens and benefits of public policy equally across race. So that's what we are talking about when we say racial equity. And so that's a really big vision that we're reaching towards. And there are 3 pillars to this work. So the first one is ideas. Yeah. So we work closely with grassroots communities to develop structurally transformative policy ideas that will support racial equity. Number 2 is leadership. So how do we move those policies? We need grassroots communities to be at the forefront, those communities most impacted by racial equity, to be able to build those leaderships so that we can get to that vision. And lastly, we do communications work. So we develop communications tools so that we can talk about race, and specifically to counter the race wedge and get to these structurally transformative policy ideas. So in a nutshell, that's who we are and what we do. All right, so jumping right into it, understanding the structural race lens. This structural race lens, this defines our work as an organization. Yeah. So before I get into it, I really want to set the table a little bit. So there's been a lot of stuff that's been happening lately. Yeah. And it seems to me that we are living in 2 Americas. Yeah. On one hand, there are folks that claim that we live in a post-racial society, you know, that racism is a thing of the past. Slavery is over. We have a black president, you know. Some people think this way, right? And the thing is, we have come a long way towards race, but there's still much more that we can do. Because on the other hand, we have big national moments. Donald Sterling, Trayvon Martin, Renisha McBride, Mike Brown, all of these big moments that remind us that race still matters, that race still has power. But unfortunately, what we see is that the tendency around the analysis is that it sticks to the individual, right? We ignore the roots of race, and we tend to think of racism as just a few bad apples, a few individuals in our society. And many of us on this call, we know that that's not the case. You know, like we know that, for example, you know, Mike Brown, he lived in a racially segregated town in one of the most racially segregated school districts in the United States. And that is not uncommon. We know that, for example, 70% of Black children who grow up in the poorest quarter of American neighborhoods, they remain in those neighborhoods as compared to only 40% of whites. And here's another fact. Within the last 10 years, the wealth gap between Black families and white families has increased by more than $95,000. This is the reality that we're living in, right? And we cannot explain that through individual acts of racism alone. So, now that we've established some context, I think it's helpful to get clear on the terms that we use. And at CSI, this is how we see it breaking down. So the first, we have individual racism. And I think this is something that a lot of people know about, right? It's about personal acts of bias or discrimination based on race. And this, we argue, is insufficient given the structural inequities that we see today. The next level is institutional racism. So we define that as the policies, practices, and procedures that work to the benefit of white people and to the detriment of people of color, often unintentionally or inadvertently. So when we say institutional racism, think of a school, think of education. You know, think about a principal seeing kids of color as inherently low achieving than white students. Or think about employment and racial discrimination in employment. So that's what we mean by institutions. And the next level is structural racism. And we define this as the history and current reality of institutional racism across multiple institutions. So this combines to create a system that negatively impacts communities of color. Yeah? So this is the level at which CSI operates. So let's go even deeper into what I mean by structure. Yeah? So this is a hypothetical community, what you're seeing on a screen. And the question that we usually give to folks when we do this training in person is we ask, do you live in a community that has all of these things, whether it's a safe and healthy home, clean public spaces, access to quality, healthy food, a good hospital, good transit, and so on and so forth, right? Some people do and some people don't, yeah? But the point is that these things, they combine to make an intricate web that cumulatively contributes to the health of people and whole communities. If you don't have one of these things, its impact is felt across all of our lives, yeah? And this is true because we don't live single issue lives, right? We are very complex people and we live in a complex system. And so a structural analysis starts to hold all of that. So, given that we live in structure, how does this apply to race? So, when we say structural racism, structural race, we are talking about multiple institutions. And we are talking about how they reinforce one another. And so what do I mean by that? In this example here, you see housing in the middle. Where you live determines how good the neighborhood school is, since public schools are funded by local property taxes. Whether you have good access to good transit, jobs, whether you live near a toxic site, and et cetera. And in this example, we have housing in the middle, but you could easily put any of these other institutions in the middle. Yeah? And so these structural arrangements, they're a result of policy decisions accumulated over generations. And people of color in the structural race lens, because of these decisions, both past and present, people of color are more often than not situated very poorly within this arrangement. So what I mean by that is that people of color, if you look across the United States, they're more likely to be near the worst schools, far from job centers, have low access to healthy food, etc., right? And we're going to get into some of those policies in a little bit. But it's because of these arrangements, and I wanted to make this note too, because we've heard people like Representative Paul Ryan talk about a culture of poverty, right? So some of us, that's a huge idea in the American consciousness. Some of us begin to attribute racialized poverty and other racial disparities as a cultural problem rather than as a symptom of these policy decisions that have created the structure. So this is what we mean by structural racism, looking at the underpinnings of racial disparity and looking at the policy decisions that made this society the way it is. And in this model, we argue that intent to discriminate is mostly irrelevant. I wouldn't say it's completely irrelevant, but it's mostly irrelevant because these institutions that we see here, they're inherently inequitable, so that even well-intentioned policy may discriminate on race, even if they don't mean to. So take, for example, economic stimulus in 2008. So, it was a big bill to be able to revitalize our economy. And most of the funding went to quote unquote shovel-ready jobs. That's the construction sector. And those that comprise the construction sector, it's mostly white and it's mostly male too. And you know what? White men, they need jobs too. They hurt in the recession as well. But what about jobs for people of color of all genders whose unemployment figures were much higher than that of white folks? That question leads us to a different approach to policy. And I got to move on because I know we're running out of time. But lastly, it's important to understand that this arrangement, structural racism, it harms everyone, including white people, because it shrinks the tax base, it underfunds public services that really help everyone, creates racial tension, obviously, and it limits economic growth, and all of these other things, right? So that is what we mean by structural racism. And so how did we get here? I talked a lot about the policies, both past and present, that created these arrangements. My colleague Julia is going to talk a little bit about what those policies are.
Good afternoon, everyone. This is Julia, and I'm going to take us on a quick trip back to our grandparents' era of the 1930s, because it's really important to understand our policy history and also understand that it is policies that we have enacted over time that have helped to invest in the success of some while presenting barriers for others. So thinking about our grandparents' era, the 1930s, New Deal era policies were passed, and for the first time in history, the government took a very prominent role in investing in what we now know as the middle class. So let's first examine Social Security, which is what we know as now as our retirement and disability benefit program. This program was biased against Black communities and women, particularly Black women, since its inception. The 1935 Act limited its coverage only to workers in commerce and industry, and this meant that this new social insurance program applied to only about half of the jobs in the economy, and among those left out were agricultural and domestic workers. In the 1930s, more than 60% of agricultural and domestic workers were Black, and therefore ineligible for any Social Security benefits. In this particular case, even though the policy appeared race neutral on its face, it wasn't. Southern Democrats in Congress were the agents who engineered this restrictive coverage policy, and what history can now tell us is that Southern Democrats in Congress, motivated by racial animus, made a political move to create the Social Security Act more palatable to Southern congressmen that benefited from the structural inclusion of Black communities to ensure the status quo of their economic system in the South. And again, as Dennis was saying about how racially discriminatory policy hurts all people, it's important to note here that Social Security Act shows a very concrete example of this. By leaving out virtually half of the workforce of its original coverage policy, many poor and working class white workers were unable to benefit from retirement and disability programs that were not only critical to their family's ability to become a part of the growing middle class, but really just a critical part of their ability of their families to survive or even thrive. Another one of the major ways that New Deal policies invested in the success of some while creating barriers for others was by making home ownership affordable for millions of families through the creation of the Federal Housing Administration. People of color, however, were redlined out of these benefits, and between 1945 and 1954, over 13 million new homes were added to the nation's housing stock, 40% of which were supported through the GI Bill. Yes, people of color were often made ineligible because of discrimination during entry into the armed forces and in the distributions of veterans' benefits. The Federal Housing Administration's policies also required or created incentives for housing discrimination by classifying communities of color and even integrated communities as risky investments. And an interesting fact, integrated communities were rated even lower than communities of color. Of the 67,000 mortgages insured under the GI Bill in New York and in the suburbs of northern New Jersey, over 66,900 of them went to white veterans. So virtually all mortgages went to white veterans. So what does all of this mean? Well, it means that these foundational policies lifted millions of white Americans out of poverty and into middle-class home ownership, yet had detrimental long-term impacts in communities of color. Not only did these policies drive neighborhood segregation, but they left communities of color situated in the most opportunity-starved neighborhoods with crumbling public school systems, the farthest from good jobs, and with inadequate transportation options. Even those able to purchase homes against all odds faced poor housing quality and lower property values. And today, people of color, no matter their income, tend to live in high poverty neighborhoods. This means that they tend to also live in neighborhoods far from good jobs, quality schools, and transportation options they need to connect them to opportunity structures, which Dennis talked a little bit about earlier. So let's fast forward to 2008 when the mortgage lending crisis rocked the United States and eventually world economies. Now, all communities were hit hard by the predatory and deregulated loan industry that stripped striving middle-class families of their savings. However, because of this history of policies that disinvested most in communities of color were most vulnerable to predatory lending schemes. Black and Latino families were much more likely to receive a subprime mortgage than their white counterparts, even when they have the same income. And this is an example of why we cannot separate race from class, because all things being equal in terms of income, race still matters and is an important factor in opportunity. So consider that Black families making more than $350,000 a year were 6 times more likely than their white counterparts to have a subprime loan. Now, had we paid attention to and addressed the ways in which communities of color were getting targeted, we may have been able to prevent the economic crisis as a whole. So this slide shows our demographic shifts as a nation. We're becoming a majority people of color nation. And this chart shows you that today, the majority of babies being born are babies of color. Now, what are the political and economic implications for all Americans given this picture? So let's look back at Social Security for a moment. How is Social Security funded? Well, it's funded through payroll taxes and self-employed contribution taxes. And this means that when all Americans are working, then funding for Social Security is doing better than when joblessness rates are high. Therefore, if unemployment rate for people of color continues to be defined by staggeringly disproportionate and inequitable rates, then the future of Social Security as a critical social safety net for older Americans and those with disabilities is at stake, and it's being threatened. So again, this is another concrete demonstration of how racially inequitable policies are important for all Americans to be concerned about as they threaten prosperity for our entire nation. So now we want to switch to thinking about how to apply the structural race lens. And before we hand it over to our friends at the Hyams Foundation, we want to introduce you to a tool that we use with organizations in our workshops to how they can begin thinking about identifying structural problems. So as Dennis mentioned, many problems are structurally produced, and therefore so are oftentimes the behaviors and belief systems of individuals. Addressing individual behavior and beliefs does not necessarily stop others from repeating them or create the conditions for better outcomes, such as great educational performance for high poverty schools. Rather, policies that diversify the education workforce or increase funding for public schools create a very different set of opportunities that address quality. And at CSI, we work with organizations and advocates, such as the Hyams Foundation and others, to develop structural strategies for community change. And I'll give you one example of a structural strategy. that had an impact on individual beliefs and behavior. And that's the civil rights movement strategy to desegregate public schools. The problems communities faced were on multiple levels: institutional, in that they lacked access to a quality education; structural, in that educational inequity meant a lack of access to good jobs and economic mobility; and individual, racial bias and discrimination was rampant. And rather than trying to educate individuals and policymakers about their bias, their strategy was structural: desegregation. Now, the impacts of this policy on individuals' beliefs and behaviors have been profound, and studies now show that because of students' increased exposure to students of other races, those that have attended integrated school systems exhibit less racial bias. And in our workshops with organizations and leaders looking to identify structural entry points to address community problems, we ask them to consider the following types of questions. So one, we ask them to consider the problem that we're trying to solve, who's most marginalized by the problem, and to consider the institutions that are impacting the problem and the policies that may be impacting the problem as well. We ask folks to think about the institutions and policies that impact the root causes, and a really simple trick that we use with folks in workshop about addressing root causes is to ask the question why. It's a very, very simple tool. Once you get to the point where you can no longer answer why, then you may have found your root cause. Okay? So from here on out, we're going to pass it over to the Hyams Foundation to talk about their work and the application of a racial equity lens in their grant making, which, based on the survey that we saw from some of you that you filled out, and thank you, that this is a piece that folks are really interested in hearing more about. So without further ado, take it away, Hyams.
Thanks so much, Julia and Dennis. Sorry to interrupt, Angela. I'm just going to pass the screen sharing over to you.
Okay.
Folks, bear with us. Angela should be sharing her screen momentarily.
Just closed it by mistake. Can you do it again? Michael?
Sure, yeah, hang on one second.
Sorry.
That's fine.
There we go. Can you see me?
We can see your screen. Thanks, Angela.
Thank you. Great. Well, again, my name is Angela Brown, and before jumping in, I just want to say a big thank you to Julia and to Dennis. I always learn something when hearing the presentation about applying a structural race analysis and some tools and approaches, and today was no exception. So thank you guys for stepping us through your, admittedly, what is usually a longer workshop. So I'm going to briefly outline what we hope to do in the next few minutes myself, and I'm joined with my colleague Naomi Torres, who's the Team Development Program Officer. She'll pick up on the second part of our remarks. We're really just going to touch upon two general areas. One, kind of from a bigger picture point of view, how did Hyams, which is as part of our mission really to foster and promote economic and social justice and power in the cities of Boston and Chelsea, Mass. How did we really get here? Why did we choose to apply a structural race analysis and begin to incorporate that analysis in our work? So I'll touch on that in a moment, and then we're going to sort of take you along for a journey with us in talking about a case study where we are actually applying this analysis in one of our three priority areas, and just to give you an update on how that's working and what that's looking like. So again, real quick, just by way of background, I wanted to let you know that this decision to really go there in terms of applying a structural race lens was pretty purposeful and was preceded by a number of board and staff learning sessions. We just had a number of speakers to come in. We have a local board. We meet pretty frequently. And so side by side, we had a number of folks come in and address us and help build our own understanding and capability about things like racial disparities, you know, what it means to look at institutions, the different levels, interpersonal, institutional, structural, but at a pretty high level. And then, and one of those presentations included then CSI President Maya Wiley to help us, you know, start to explore and sort of sit with this structural analysis. I want to mention that prior to this journey, which began about 4 years ago, of doing our own capacity building internally, you know, this all kind of built on a long trajectory of work over time in different areas. You know, as a funder that works currently in affordable housing, civic engagement, which is kind of a broad term for community organizing and grassroots organizing, and team development, along with that, a series of strategies in those areas, you know, had really been an organization ourselves that had, for example, worked with other funders to establish an intermediary called the Inclusion Initiative, who partners with locally based CBOs to set up processes to become much more intentionally inclusive organizations at board and staff level. We have frequent conversations with grantees around their own journey and their own progress, really heart to heart and hopefully, you know, authentic conversation about, you know, ways to improve and what the journey is really like, and still, you know, sort of lift up that we're very purposeful in our funding, that we're really trying to advance diverse, inclusive organizations. I just throw this out that we had done, you know, a lot of investing in youth organizing, immigrant leadership, structural pieces like the redistricting process that took place here in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, et cetera. So a little bit of some building blocks to work with, you know, 3 years ago when we really began this journey. I think I would lift up that one of the things that was emerging from the conversation with our board at that same time is that they really wanted a bigger impact. They really wanted us to go deeper, to kind of push ourselves, perhaps, to sort of say, okay, Hyams staff, it's great to be talking about social and economic justice and sort of have implicitly a focus on racial inclusion, but what would it be like to kind of push ourselves a little bit further, perhaps into our own discomfort, to sort of be race explicit and really take on bigger structural issues and solutions. So around about that time, we then did a collaboration with the Center for Social Inclusion, leading after Maya's initial presentation, which led to a couple of days workshops with board and staff again. And we, through a process that was very participatory, built our own working definition of racial justice, you know, a really nice activity to try to think about what does that really mean for us given our history and our moment in time. And so I'll just, you know, let you take a look at this, but you'll notice that it touches on some of the things that came out in the earlier presentations. Racial justice is when systems and structures create the conditions for increased collective well-being and produce equitable power, access, opportunities, and outcomes, that equitable outcomes piece being very important for us, regardless of race. So in there, it's the idea that it's not enough to close disparity gaps, but what are we doing to kind of lift overall well-being? If we're just redistributing pain around painful circumstances, that just didn't feel aspirational to us. We wanted to actually lift overall well-being as well as specifically closing those disparity gaps. One of the things that I think appealed to our board about this definition, which they did vote on and adopt, is that the idea of advancing change that in a way is more durable, durable solutions, that ideally if we're working on something that is truly structural, that it's a battle that you might have once, you know, in a few years and not have the same battle, whether that's a policy fight or an institutional fight, not have it be a year after year fight, which we had noticed that some of the wins that our groups and our efforts had led to were kind of year by year battles. And then, as importantly, that could we be influencing multiple institutions and policies? So those are some of the concepts that are really in this definition. I would just also, end this part of the remarks by saying that we're really excited about the current work, which is exemplifies that idea of can we continue to build our own capacity through a learning by doing. And so, as was mentioned, we do fund in 3 areas, and we chose to then apply this definition to one of the areas, the youth development goal that Naida is going to speak to. But I would say, along with doing the learning by doing, we do continue to reflect and read articles and have speakers, things of that nature. The Philanthropic Initiative for Racial Equity is a resource of that sort. They have sessions, what have you. So it's just a note of encouragement that we're all in this together, and to kind of keep on working at connecting and learning and sharing practices with other groups. It's really, really important. We continue to try to do that. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Naomi Torres, who's going to speak about the structural race entry point we came up with.
Great. Thank you, Angela, and thank you to all of you who've joined us for this panel, and to EPIP for creating this space for this important conversation. So as Angela laid out, there was a lot of foundational work that the Hyams Foundation did really to reach this point, but through the board and staff's work with CSI to identify an entry point for applying a racial justice lens, the foundation zeroed in on education financing and progressive tax policy, and more specifically as a structural lever to address disparities that we were seeing in educational outcomes for youth in our communities, as well as disparities in access to youth employment and other priorities that we were hearing from our youth organizing groups. So why did we focus on education financing and progressive tax policy? Well, we saw dramatic cuts to the Commonwealth's investment in education, leading to decreased supports for low-income youth and youth of color in our schools. We knew that schools in predominantly low-income communities and communities of color were underfunded, and found that our state's education funding program, designed to help mitigate resource disparities between predominantly low-income and higher-income districts, had become increasingly limited due to a funding formula which didn't adequately account for rising health insurance and special education costs and years of declining state tax revenues. These and other disinvestments had stemmed in part from cuts to the income tax and other taxes in the late 90s, leading to about $3 billion less in annual state revenue in 2012 compared to the late 90s, and increasing pressure on the part of districts to turn to local revenue sources to fill the education funding gap. So we concluded that new revenue could be a key structural lever, and that progressive tax policies that didn't disproportionately burden low-income communities and communities of color had to be part of the equation. At the same time, our youth organizing grantees were finding themselves increasingly limited by the cycle of annual budget advocacy, which Angela alluded to support youth jobs or other youth priorities. And those led to short-term wins, but they had to be refought each year. We also saw groups advocating for dropout prevention and re-engagement policy, only to have policy solutions get stymied by the absence of revenue to support their passage or implementation. Across the field, we were beginning to see some groups strengthening their structural analysis and identifying the need for more durable solutions. And we wanted to find ways to continue to build their capacity to apply this analysis. Fortuitously, a new and fair revenue campaign began to emerge in Massachusetts in 2013, creating a window for Hyams to really engage our grantees in a timely and relevant funding pilot. As you see noted here, this first pilot of $317,000 in special grants supported 9 youth organizing groups, as well as 3 adult-based groups, and those focused really on building their capacity to apply a structural analysis, do popular education around the need for new and fair revenue to support youth policy priorities, and equitable outcomes. And while that campaign, unfortunately, was not as successful as we would have hoped and yielded modest wins in additional revenue for transportation, we really feel that our grantees learned lots of lessons from that first year of work, as did Hyams. So this year, in the absence of a specific political window, we wrestled with what was the best strategy to build on this first phase of work. And we ultimately decided that we want to continue to build the capacity of our youth organizing grantees. So you will see in 2014, we did another round of special grants totaling $170,000 to 10 youth organizing groups, again, to work on their capacity to apply the structural analysis, to connect new and fair revenue to their policy agendas, and to continue to educate and engage others and popularize this issue. And while it's still early days, some early indicators of progress include groups beginning to frame their policy priorities more broadly, so connecting youth jobs and fair revenue, for example. We're also seeing groups move the discussion from what funding do we need this year to what kind of a community do we want and need for young people to thrive, and how can new and fair revenue be part of that equation and advance that vision. We continue to be really excited about the efforts underway and the potential for the groups to learn from each other and collaborate to tackle shared challenges. For example, how do you create a compelling narrative about why new and fair revenue matters in the state of Massachusetts, which so often is framed as Taxachusetts. So it's not an easy battle. It's certainly an uphill one, but our groups are learning a lot, as are we. Thank you.
So we're really just excited to share this living example, and again, as mentioned, we'll be continuing to apply this lens and throughout our work. So we're really ready for any kind of questions or comments or feedback, and really encourage folks to stay in touch with us. Thanks.
Thank you, Angela. Thank you, Nahida. That was really interesting to learn how you're implementing a lot of these concepts to your work and your programs. Folks, this is a great time for you to submit any questions you have for any of our 4 speakers. I certainly have my own, but we'd love to hear from you. You've heard plenty from me already. So we'll keep an eye open for that. But in the meantime, while folks probably gather a few questions or brainstorm around those, I'd love to ask you guys a couple. And one I'd like to start with, and this is something we ask actually on a number of our webinars, because we're talking about a lot of these issues at the conceptual level. But in the data-driven world we live in, one of the challenges is learning where you're making a difference and how you measure impact. And I'd be interested to hear any of you all kind of speak to that and really, tell us a bit more about how you really measure impact at the ground level.
Thanks, Michael. I can kick it off, and Naid will add to, with no doubt. I think
Great.
One answer is just that simply that we have to look at both progress indicators that are sort of touch points, kind of directionally maybe along the way, that sort of tell you you're perhaps onto something. It may not be as linear always when you're doing policy advocacy or institutional or structural change, or trying to be a resource ally and a catalyst or instigator of this type of change. So one of the things is to kind of look at both. You mentioned being data driven. It's both quantitative and also sort of those qualitative, are the caliber of the relationships and the networks between and amongst groups who we already have a great deal of confidence in around their policy work, but now they're doing something that's really quite new or a bit different. And so sometimes being open to those more qualitative indicators can be helpful. I don't know if you want to add to that.
And there's a publication whose title is escaping me, but Michael, I will follow up so you can share it with those on the line, that it talks about this very issue. And when you're thinking about work that is transformative and is structural, then you're looking for a shift from transactional outcomes, policy outcomes, which often are annual budgetary wins. And I don't mean to take those for granted. We find those critical as well, but really a shift towards more transformative engagement, constituent engagement, partnerships with other organizing groups. And so those were the things that we were looking for from our grantees, a different way of framing the issue in a more transformative manner that brought more people to the table and helped connect them to the issue. Also the way that they partnered with each other in that collective framing, and I think a higher level of sophistication in their various organizing strategies. Again, there are certainly some quantitative measures that we look at, but we find that the qualitative measures that get at that shift in their lens and approach to be just as important.
And this is Julia from CSI. I'll also add, and we have some resources we can share with folks after this call, of another tool that we use to help organizations think about whether or not the policy demands that they have identified will actually get to the racially equitable impacts that they desire. So, for example, within let's say a grant-making program that's focused on socioeconomic strategies, to sort of address poverty, then we want to ask questions as to whether or not people of color will experience greater opportunities to access jobs and education than before with this policy. Or we'll ask the question, will people of color have greater opportunities to build wealth as a result of this policy and its implementation? We do work around sustainable food systems, and in our food work, one of the questions that we ask as we work with groups to identify policy solutions is the question of, will people of color be able to become owners across the food system? Will they be able to own more of the distribution channels for food, right? So there's several questions that we can share, a tool that we have that will help groups really think about the impact on people of color communities in addition to poor folks as well. Because again, as we mentioned, race and class are so interrelated, and when you drop race out too often, we lose the impact that we really desire around racial equity.
Thanks, Julia. I think that's a really important framing for that, and it's always, it's a challenge, right, to balance, qualitative and quantitative measures. But thank you all for those answers. We actually had a question come in from the audience from Joycelyn Macbeth. Thanks, Joycelyn. She asks, can you highlight key opportunities in policy that surface in successful social justice work? What should we keep an ear to identify these opportunities to engage in effective policy change? So I'll open that up to any of our speakers.
Can you repeat the question just one more time?
No problem. Can you highlight key opportunities in policy that surface in successful social justice work? So what should we keep an ear to identify those kinds of opportunities to engage in real effective policy change?
Yep. So this is Julia from CSI. And I'll add, really, I think it depends on the issue that folks are wanting to take up, the political landscape, right? Because and opportunities to sort of leverage work that you've already been doing to identify other wins, right? And the handout that we'll be sending to you all afterwards, the tool around how to identify structural problems, offers some questions to sort of get at the kinds of policy entry points that will be able to achieve those wins around decreasing racial and ethnic disparities. I'll give an example. I mentioned our food work, and we were convening a group of leaders about a year ago who were doing work nationally and locally around creating more sustainable regional food systems that support the delivery of affordable and quality food to communities of color and poor folks who are living in food deserts and food swamps. And by food swamps, we basically mean, those communities that might be saturated with food opportunities. Let's say like Harlem, where I live, there are a lot of fried chicken spots, but not a lot of good, healthy food options, right? So that's what we mean by food swamps. We found in doing this work that one interesting entry point was around a provision in the Affordable Care Act, which mandates that every nonprofit hospital must conduct a community health needs assessment, right? And so we focused in on that as a potential opportunity around figuring out how hospitals, right, as a huge distributor of food, a huge institution that has food delivery as part of its part of its core. The community health needs assessment component was actually an entry point for our work around thinking about how procurement of food from local farmers, sourced by regional food, is sourced by local farmers, distributed through regional food hubs, could have an impact on the health outcomes of folks of color and their ability to access healthy food, right? So it's really, I don't think it's definitely a complex, set of questions that folks have to really ask themselves, and it's based on, opportunity, right, to leverage past gains. It also depends on the political landscape. I think also Nahir talked about partnerships, right? Are there ways to be able to sort of leverage partnerships that we have to be able to sort of create a new entry point? And so what we'll do is we'll make sure to send around that tool of questions to folks to aid you all in thinking about how to think about structural racial equity entry points around both policy, but also as you all consider your grant making work as well.
This is Dennis from CSI. Thank you for that, Julia. And I think as an organization, we've seen nationally, there's not a lot of opportunity. I think we know how this Congress is, right? And we've seen nationally, race is a third rail. It's really hard to talk about race. And whenever we try to talk about it, they're accusing us of playing the race card. Can't tell you how many times that happens to us. And that's false, because people who are looking to chip away at government, chip away at investments that are large, they're talking about race all the time, but they're not using the right words, right? So I think that there's an opportunity for us to push back. And I think part of what we do at CSI is we develop messages so that we can push back on that race wedge, right? Like, so when I say that, I mean like people who are conjuring the welfare queen, right? They're not saying black women, but they're conjuring an image of a black woman and it's an attempt to disinvest from social safety net problems. And where I see the most opportunity actually is on the local level, right? Like we are actually part of this group called the Government Alliance on Racial Equity, and we're seeing a lot of movement around like city councils, cities in general, even just neighborhoods who are really looking to do good by race, right? And they just don't know how. And I think that with a structural race analysis, we can begin to talk about all of these different policies together to be able to create racial equity. And I think for me right now, I'm paying attention to Ferguson. The entire country is paying attention to Ferguson. And I think that, policing is definitely the right issue. Like, we should be focusing on police processes that are happening there. But I also want to talk about the housing situation in that neighborhood. I want to talk about educational outcomes, all of these things, right? Because, this community, yes, they are mad about Mike Brown, but they're mad about a lot of different things too. And I think that, if there's an opportunity to talk about racial equity and to operationalize some things over there, that would be the type of change that I'm looking for, and now with the national spotlight, it shifted a little bit away from it, but it's still part of the national consciousness right now. I think that's a huge opportunity. And I think other neighborhoods, cities, and communities can follow suit.
Yeah, this is Angela. I think I would just echo and piggyback off of Dennis and Julia, what you've just laid out, some considerations, and really want to say an amen to the local and regional strategies. I feel like there is a lot of reason to be excited about different things that are going on the ground, but just in terms of a methodology thing, I think it's a little, one of the things that we've been sort of asking ourselves are, what are some of the broader policy issue buckets where we start to see a number of grassroots and community-based groups kind of beginning to work in alignment, even if they're not necessarily all playing in the same sandbox, but where we're starting to see patterns and the ingredients of what could be a functioning civic activism ecosystem to kind of push the needle. And the most recent example, and so one answer is, looking at that at each local context is probably going to be very, very different in a California versus a Massachusetts versus a Tennessee or what have you, just to be throwing out different geographic areas. But one recent example is that Massachusetts did enact a minimum wage, and it was, we're starting to see that in other parts of the country, right? And I think the different local and regional campaigns are starting to feed off of each other. So that feels like a very hopeful moment in a way, knowing that that's not the be-all and the end-all in terms of getting to ultimately fair wage, but it's a step, in terms of building power and building some momentum. And then, the other reason that we were very excited about this progressive tax and the idea of utilizing Massachusetts income tax, proposing reform of that tax to create new and fair revenue, is even just doing the exercise of what might it take to get to a win. It started, our program committee and staff started really mapping out some bigger levers and starting to think about, the electoral outcomes what we're seeing in different parts of the state. It started us really thinking more broadly about our different areas of our funding and how they actually have potential to connect right down to the ground to equitable outcomes for youth of color, and to see more of those connections. Also the notion that calling out for employers to sort of see their self-interest could be a potential opportunity that we would like to tease out. If young people are not graduating school, college, and career ready, what is the outlook for our region's economic prosperity if those inequities persist? So just a few, but when you notice sort of those larger things kind of playing in as part of the solutions to moving towards an outcome, that feels exciting for us.
Thanks so much, Angela. That was a fantastic answer, and thanks, Dennis and Julia. I think we really actually covered a lot. We're actually just up at about 4 p.m. Eastern, and don't think we have any more time left. I want to thank all of the attendees for joining us today. I hope you learned something, and remember to please complete the post-webinar survey so we can learn more and try and improve our webinar programs. And I really want to thank our speakers, Angela, Nahid, Dennis, Julia. We learned so much today. Thank you all for your contributions of time and talent. We are very, very appreciative.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, folks, and hopefully we'll do this again soon. Take care, everyone, and have a great day.
All right. Bye.
Bye.